What happens to a human after death? Human beings have always asked what happens when life ends, but the question itself is often distorted by fear, tradition, or wishful thinking. A clearer approach begins by separating the end of the person from the fate of conscious awareness. The body dies. The narrative identity dissolves. But whether the underlying experience of awareness itself ceases or transitions is a different question, one that remains open. When we look closely at how the universe behaves, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue that consciousness simply vanishes. Nothing else in nature behaves that abruptly. Matter transforms. Energy transforms. Information is preserved even when systems collapse. Consciousness, the most mysterious and least understood phenomenon we know, seems unlikely to be the only thing exempt from these universal patterns. Our current scientific models describe the brain as a physical system, but they cannot explain why subjective experience arises at all. Neurons fire, networks activate, chemical gradients shift, yet none of that explains what it is like to feel, to perceive, or to exist. Because consciousness has no clear physical substrate, many theorists propose that the brain acts less like an engine producing consciousness and more like a filter shaping and limiting a deeper, more fundamental awareness. Under this model, death does not destroy consciousness, it dissolves the structure that constrained and shaped it. This interpretation aligns with a striking feature of subjective experience. It has no physical location. Thoughts occupy no space. Awareness has no coordinates. The boundaries of experience are not found in the brain tissue itself. When something has no spatial footprint, the idea that it ends in the physical sense becomes conceptually thin. It is more coherent to imagine that the individual point of view ends, while the underlying property, awareness, remains part of the fabric of reality. Modern physics offers further reason to take this seriously. Information cannot be destroyed. Quantum systems behave differently when observed. The universe appears to preserve the state of everything that has ever occurred in a deep informational structure. If consciousness is tied to the informational structure of reality rather than the mechanics of the brain alone, its termination becomes much harder to justify. Instead, it may undergo a transition akin to energy changing form when a flame is extinguished. The flame disappears as an identifiable pattern, but the energy continues in other forms. From the inside perspective of the dying person, the end of life is not darkness or fear. It is simply the last moment of time they experience. When the structures generating personal identity dissolve, the story ends, but the silence that follows is not annihilation. It is the absence of the personal narrative. The raw capacity for awareness, the basic light behind the experience, may return to a more fundamental state, one without memory, self-reference, or boundaries. This does not imply reincarnation in the traditional sense, nor a personal afterlife, nor the preservation of the ego. What continues, if anything does, is not you as a character, but the underlying field of consciousness from which the sense of you was constructed. The self is temporary and fragile. Awareness is stable and pervasive. It resembles something more elemental than personality, more like a universal property that individual brains shape into a point of view. In this framework, death represents a transition from structured consciousness to unstructured consciousness, from a bounded, self-reflective experience to a state of pure being free of narrative. No memories, no identity, no temporal flow. Simply awareness without a story attached to it. This view rejects both extremes. It does not claim that nothingness follows death, nor does it promise continuity of the personal self. Instead, it proposes that the universe recycles consciousness the same way it recycles everything else. What begins with a body ends with the dissolution of the body, but the awareness that animated it returns to the larger reality that produced it. While definitive answers remain beyond our reach, this perspective fits the known behavior of physical laws, the unresolved nature of consciousness, and the strange fact that experience itself does not belong to the material world. The person dies. The story ends. But the awareness behind it likely continues, not as someone, but as the fundamental presence from which all someones arise.